r/AskReddit. Airplane pilots, what was your biggest, we're all doomed moment that you survived and your passengers didn't notice? I used to fly photographers to southern Utah and Colorado to survey land. One day I had a fuel indicator malfunction, and I realized we were 10 minutes away from our engine shutting off. Landed at a small airport we passed a bit ago, while running on fumes. The photographer had no idea that, if we didn't land, we would have had to ditch the plane in the hot desert with no cell reception or hope of getting recused for a while. Holy balls dude, if you are still flying in an area where there is no cell phone reception and your radio won't work for whatever reason, for the love of God get a sat phone. The plans are not very expensive. Better than dying of thirst in a desert. Learn from the experience and have one now. I also carry survival gear equipped for the terrain I plan on flying over now also. I spent 10 years fighting forest fires with the British Columbia Ministry of Forests. On the ground, I'm not a pilot. We're on a fire up in northern BC, late in the season, just trying to get it done, so we can put a pin in the year. The helicopter we've been flying in has a sticky tail boom door light in the cockpit. Tail booms can be hollow in larger machines. You put equipment back there, chainsaws, water pumps, hose, backpacks, fuel cans. All week we've been loading the thing up to the gills. It holds 9 firefighters and all their associated gear, so needless to say, the tail boom is packed every day with things that you do not want falling out while in flight and sailing right into the tail rotor. And all week every time we are ready to take off, this stupid light in the cockpit goes off, and someone at the door seat has to get out and go back there and make sure that yes, the door is actually closed. Well, it's been a long couple weeks. We get in, go to take off, and the light goes off again. I'm sitting in the second front seat next to the pilot, and he looks at me and says something to the effect of holy Christ, the boom door again. Well, what do you figure? Should we check? I sigh. I just want to go for a rip over the trees and get this day done so we can go home, but it's not me that has to get out. It's the rookie who is sat in the rear door seat. So I say, duck, we should just go, but let's check it anyways. Hey back there, whoever was last at the door, get out and double check it, okay? Everyone sighs. Rookie gets unbuckled, gets out to check. We wait. Helicopter is idling. He gets back in, gets his seatbelt on, gets his headset on. He's somehow both red and white in the face at the same time. Yeah, the rear door was open. I closed it. We are good to go. Rookie was the last one at the door. Had we taken off, everything in that tail boom would have rattled its way out, careened through the tail rotor, and sent us into the ground in a spin. There were 9 of us on board, including the pilot. We all just kept that one to ourselves. From then on we had a rule. 2 people at the door. 1 guy holds, 1 guy loads. Guy who holds the door closes it. That's his only job. My uncle was an airplane pilot and trainer for decades. He also built small single-engine prop planes for himself and others. He crashed 2 of them. I think both times he ran out of gas while flying. I asked him, how the duck do you do that? Can't you check your gas gauge? But these small planes don't have gas gauges. You fill them up and know how long they run for. But if you have a leak in your gas lines, then you run out of gas. Which he did twice. Walked away from both of them. On a side note, he also took a plane out of Cuba, and they told him they were going to shoot him down, but he just noped out of there at low altitude. It was his friend's plane, but had been confiscated by the Cuban government. Pilots back then were ducking real-world cowboys. Your uncle was a cigar smuggler? Lol, no. But the plane out of Cuba story is awesome. A friend of his got his plane confiscated by the Cuban govt because he flew over Cuba during a time that was allowed. The Cuban gov threw my uncle's friend in jail for a while, where he traded his Rolex for a toothbrush and other sanitary needs. He eventually was sent back to the US without his plane. Long story short, through diplomatic channels he was able to get his plane back, but they wouldn't let him enter Cuba to get it, so he asked my uncle to pick it up for him. My uncle goes to Cuba, attends a bunch of diplomatic embassy, Sweden, or Netherlands or something, events, and eventually gets the okay to fly the plane out. The Cuban gov treated the plane like shit. There were cigar burns in the seats, the props had been shaved poorly, so the engines wouldn't sink. When my uncle got the plane started, the tower refused clearance to take off, and told him to return to the hangar. So he said duck it, and just jammed the throttle and took off. His was thinking he could get into US airspace faster than they could scramble fighters. So he just stayed low over the ocean, until he got to US airspace. He has a lot of good stories, but this is one of the most dramatic. He was also a guy who we don't know how many times he was married. The answer was anywhere between 5 and 8 depending on what day you asked him. Not a pilot, but this was the scariest plane landing I experienced. I was flying into MSP on a standard commercial airliner. In the seconds before the tires touched the runway, the plane rolled hard to the left. The plane made an equally hard recovery just before the plane's back wheels hit the runway. The sequence of events was boom, boom, boom. The plane landed safely. As the passengers were disembarking, one of the pilots stood outside the cockpit door pale and sweating. He shook every passenger's hand on the way out. I don't know much about aviation, but I always thought that plane just barely avoided a crash landing that day. Airline pilot here. Flying into MSP while green, under 100 hours in type, had my first experience circumnavigating a thunderstorm passing overhead. Think of that GIF where ATC routes all the planes around a storm. We had to re-enter the full arrival procedures at least 3 times, because of storm movement. During the constant reroutes we had lightning striking. I learned lightning looks very blue, which destroyed radio communications making it take much longer than it should. The turbulence was strong, but not overly strong. However, it did make trying to re-enter arrival info very difficult. Over time multiple other aircraft had to divert, since flying around the airport instead of directly at it is not very efficient. We were mulling over making that decision, since we couldn't be certain that we would get in this time. Finally we get I'm on final approach, it's still my leg flying. Captain decides that, since I'm green, that he's gonna take over. I was a bit annoyed, because although the wind was very strong, it was stable. Everything seemed fine, until about 200 feet off the runway, when the wind sheared hard and the plane was violently shook around. We would have gone around, except that by the time it stabilized we had touchdown. Felt glad that he took over. Anyways, what you're describing sounds like wake turbulence. Basically your plane flew into another aircraft's wake. One outcome is a very sharp, but somehow stable roll. I wouldn't say this is a duck up moment, but it has stuck with me. I'm 17 and one time, after I had finished flight training I stopped off at Double Eagle Airport to drop off my instructor. So I drop off my instructor. This was about 7 months after my solo, and as I'm stepping out to the plane, a friend lets me fly his 182, as long as I help with the fuel and hangar costs. These 2 people come up and ask if I can take them up to Santa Fe. I say yes, but I feel kinda weird, so before I let them get in I go through and change the weight and balance so that the airplane's CG is properly centered, after accounting for the weight of the payload, and after we do that, I crank up and head off for the runway. About 5 minutes after taking off, I notice that the engine is sounding slightly cranky. I think oh shit, but after about 30 seconds it calms down. 10 minutes out of Double Eagle, the engine sounds moderately cranky and doesn't smooth out for 6 minutes. This is concerning. Since I don't have very many hours time I decided not to risk it, so I advised ABQ Center of the issue and asked for vectors back to Double Eagle. They acknowledged and asked if I was declaring an emergency. I've read about pilots who have refrained from declaring an emergency until it was too late, and I considered it, but decided after looking at the instruments that I would wait, since I was within gliding distance of a relatively flat area with almost no ground obstructions. I advised the passengers of my decision, and then started the turn back. I landed uneventfully, and as it turned out, some water had gotten into the fuel tanks. Even though I had checked them, I apparently didn't do it well enough. Oh well, sometimes we're lucky enough to be around to learn about our mistakes. So after draining the tanks and refilling them, I flew the 2 to Santa Fe and came back, and the engine sounded fine. Moral of the story? Always check the small things twice. Not a pilot, but one time I was flying to Atlanta from a small regional airport and the first leg of the flight was a small turboprop puddle jumper to Newark. It was pouring rain as we boarded, and when I sat in my seat it was soaked with water. I looked around to see if anyone else was experiencing it, but it was just me. Called a flight attendant over, and she said, oh, it's just the condensation from the AC. I actually accepted that answer and then realized how completely not normal it was. Called another flight attendant over and she said, oh, that's weird, I'll grab the pilot. Pilot comes, sees a puddle, and was like, duck, that's not good. External inspection of the plane showed a panel and some bolts had sheared off on the previous flight. So we deplaned. And they took the plane out of service. Worst part, passengers swore at me and told me to duck myself as we all exited. Everyone was mad we didn't get to fly on a shitty broken plane. You did the right thing, but, as always, no good deed goes unpunished. Also, you need to be alive to bitch at someone, and who the heck knows what could have happened had that plane kept flying.